Hey everyone, you having fun? Yeah? So far, good? Learning? Yeah? All right, we'll try to keep the same train. My name is Julian, and I'm a senior mobile engineer at HealthFirst. HealthFirst is a health insurance company in the state of New York that provides healthcare for people over 65, which is Medicare, and Medicaid, which is low income as well. Today I wanted to share some of our experiences when using VIPER. So what we'll try to cover today is how we came to choose the architecture, what is VIPER as a thing, we also hit a few bumps in the road that we also wanted to share with you, and a little bit more in the future looking what can we do to incorporate Swift2i and combine into our code base. Like most journeys, they all start with one step. Ours was to choose the architecture. There were a few considerations that we had in mind when we first embarked into this quest. For us, it was, how big is our team? Usually is a good, important factor to keep in mind. We had 4 full-time engineers at the time, with an eye on growing. Today, we're about 10 full-time iOS engineers. What is the level of experience for the team? When we first started, we had a good crowd of mid to high senior people that knew or had been around the block for a little bit. How long do we expect the project to last, which is also an interesting thing when you're choosing a new architecture. In our case, we hopefully expect our projects to last forever. What are the number of screens and features that we're going to be doing? Because one thing is when you're doing a small app for an event or a demo or something that you can just pretty much do something different and throw it out afterwards, as opposed to something that you want to last for long. Well, in our case, we were going for the long run. And also devices. We are mostly focused on iPhone devices. We do support iPad, but in a longer or smaller capacity. And we're looking at being cross-platform. Not right now, but in the coming years. I forgot to say this earlier. We are not publicly out in market yet. It's been a year, and we're doing public betas now throughout test flight. One last thing was testing coverage, which is a very, very important thing, in my opinion, when you're starting a new project. And we're going to do a little bit of everything. So unit tests in Swift, we use Quick and Nimble for that. Automation test, which are more of the integration stuff. We use Appium, which is it relies on XUI automation to run, and we have a different team that does that. It's more about tapping around and like integration and then testing, and then we also have a team of manual QA testers. So this is what our decision matrix looked like. We compared the following architectures based on the parameters that you can see in the columns. So we had obviously MVC, MVVM, RxSwift plus MVVM, because most times RxSwift comes along with some other pattern. You don't just like use it by itself. And VIPER. So for parameters, we're looking at scalability, which is how does this architecture behave as the app grows and screens and behaviors that it'll do. How easy would it be to switch from said architecture to a different one if we decided to, because most times there will be some new thing that you want to put into your app, and you want to make sure that you can move and adjust as the code does. So at the time, there was no Swift2i, and that was for example, one thing that we would have needed to adjust for. And then learning curve, which is not a small factor. It's how easy can you get a new team member to be productive in the code base as they just land into the team, right? And then cross-platform, which I mentioned earlier. So we are doing native code we're going to be doing native code for either platform, but we still want some sort of resemblance between the code bases. So having ViewController A mapped to some sort of Android counterpart. So we try to consider that into one of our parameters. And as you can see in our ranking, obviously this differs in different teams, and it might not be the same for you. But for us, VIPER was ranking pretty well, other than the learning curve, which is pretty steep, and we'll get into that in a bit. So, but you do a lot of research, but like most very important life decisions, you still got to ask Google. So we did that too, and typed in there, and then we got this one. But this always happens when you're searching for something. So we had this let's say, opinionated Reddit user that said, no, VIPER is what happens when former enterprise Java programmers invade the iOS world. So it wasn't quite the first result anyways. I just put it there because it made me laugh. We didn't really give a lot of weight to our angry Reddit user, so we moved on. And speaking about Java, VIPER is one of the architectures that abides by the solid principles. If you haven't heard about solid, it's a set of things that you can do in your code, irrespective of the platform, that will help you be scalable and reusable. So things like single responsibility principle. I'm sure you heard about that. Quick show of hands. Yes? All right, well, good. So there's the ones that you probably use and work for, and some that are not as well known as our friend Liskov there. But the one that I'm more interested with is the dependency inversion, and interface segregation actually helps for that. So meaning having a whole bunch of different interfaces for your contract between your classes that you can then swap out with different models as you perform your testing. And for dependency inversion, that is a segue, in my opinion, because you can I'll define it first. Dependency inversion is when you can define your state for a class or object by passing in all your parameters that need to form the state where you're at in your mobile app or project outside of mobile as well. So then you can even use frameworks for this. This exists from Java world, but also is out for a while. There's this framework called Typhoon for Objective-C, for those who've been out doing this for a while. So you can essentially declare the state that you want for your object, and it helps a lot for unit tests. So this is one of the things that comes with VIPER pretty much out of the box. So a lot of talk, but let's get into it. What is VIPER? VIPER stands for those 5 classes or the objects that you need to have in your module. So with this 5 of components, you create what we call a VIPER module, which usually maps out to a screen in your mobile app. So there's like a one-on-one correlation. Whenever you create a new screen or something like that, you mostly have to create a VIPER module for it. So it comes with a view, which at the end will end up not containing a lot of business logic. The interactor, sometimes also called protocol. There's the presenter, the entity, which is your classic model that I'm pretty sure you have anyways, depending on the architecture. And then the router, or also called wireframe, depends on who's writing it. So anyways, when you start breaking out your code from what normally would be like MVC or like big blocks of code into a lot of small classes that do one thing and one thing only, then you end up having pretty much a dumb ViewController that doesn't do a lot, like mostly just like presenting and setting that up there, and that also helps greatly for testing. So this was our first stab at the architecture diagram. You have the classes that we described before, but as you can see, there's a lot of classes that come with that, and with that comes boilerplate, and that's not something that we want to be doing. We don't want to remember what it's like to set up all those classes every time that you start a project or a new screen, even with a project, which happens more often. So we came up with an Xcode template for this solution, which there's already many of them available. We just decided to do our own because there's a lot of subtleties in the naming convention and how the properties are defined, and we also wanted to have our own control in maintaining that and growing it as we needed it. So that when you create a new file in our Xcode project, you'll find 2 options that you normally wouldn't have, which one is for initializing your project, and the other one is for creating a module that you use more often when you're creating different screens and adding stuff into your application. So the initialize template is mostly, it's actually what's up on the screen now. So you get a bunch of empty interfaces that define each of the components in our architecture that we talked about. And then we have our base wireframe, which is the class that's up there. That is the parent class of all other wireframes in the code base. It simply just has a reference to the ViewController and a shortcut for accessing navigation as well. So let's say we created a landing page with our second option in our template, and then you would get what's up on the screen now, where you have an enum at the top that lists where you can get from your application. So you're here, you can get to all these other places in views in your code base, and it also through object binding allows you to pass in some parameter that you might need to initialize the state of the second or whichever number of screen that you're going to. Then the rest is mostly interfaces, and then we get to the actual code for a presenter. As you can see, it's mostly references that map directly to the diagram that you saw before in initializing. Same for your interactor. And the wireframe has a little bit more stuff on it. So it initializes the objects and connects them together. And that's the single entry point where you create a new module as you're building and designing your screens. So the Landing ViewController, which is the final class of this VIPER module for a single screen, contains a presenter, and then it's mostly dumb UI kit stuff where you just do the lifecycle methods. And we're halfway through our journey, doing a good number of screens, and then we hit a few bumps in the road, which looked like this. So we were having some memory profile issues, particularly the blue graph there with the staircase shows what was happening in our mobile app as we went back and forth simply from one of the screens that contains a map from the Google Maps SDK. And because that one is on OpenGL, it's usually substantial and it loads a lot of memory, so it's easy to notice when you have some sort of memory issue. We was exactly adding 80 megabytes every time that you go back and forth from that page. So we relied on the tools that Apple provides, plus a few other things. And the memory debugger was a good friend when looking into this and seeing that the reference cycle was exactly incrementing in 1 as we went back and forth into the page, which led to a bit of investigation and why was this happening. As it turns out, our first version of the diagram, which I skipped through kind of fast on purpose, had bidirectional strong references to pretty much every component in VIPER, which caused everything to be tangled together. So every VIPER component would have been leaked by that approach. The solution for this is handle memory differently. So now you can see solid lines and dotted lines. Dotted lines are weak references, and solid lines are strong references. For those who started just in Swift, there's this thing called ARC, which is automatic reference count. It still exists. It still comes back every now and then. And this is pretty much what it felt like when we were going through the memory graph and seeing which line was solid and how we were retaining our modules. It's pretty frustrating trying to help our friend Mice here find the cheese. So B2 for our template is pretty much the same as what you saw before. So the interactor contains a weak reference to a presenter, and then our base wireframe, the rest of the code is still there. We just hit it for this. Now has a weak reference to the ViewController. So, but then there's the presenter, which used to have just constants, and there is no such thing as weak for a constant. So what exists is unknown. Have you guys used unknown? Yes? No? Yes? All right. So it's not. I don't see a lot of hands. It was you don't often use that. It was the same case for us. So a good example that I found on that and why it is, or how does it work, in the memory management, it doesn't increment the reference count, so it's still nullable, but the runtime does not expect this to be nil. Like if it is nil, it'll crash. So an example of when you would use own versus weak is an apartment can exist without a human. You can have an empty apartment that you're not renting or doing anything with, and then you would use weak. But for example, a credit card cannot exist without a human, and then you would use unknown for that. That helped it make clear for me. So going back to the rest of our template, there is a slight issue with this change that we just talked about, which is by the redx, where as soon as the constructor goes out of scope, the ViewController is not being held strongly by anything, so then it goes out of scope and you lose the reference to it as soon as you instantiate it. So we had to figure out something for this, and that led us to, well, we can actually see that in our diagram, because if you look at this again, there's no way to find a path with a solid line from the ViewController to the wireframe, and that's why it goes out of scope and crashes instantaneously. So the solution was to introduce a builder class. Some people call this VIPER B because of the builder, which is essentially a class that has a static method, and I'll, again, connect all the components with the difference that it holds a strong reference to them as they're being connected, and then as a return type, you get a UI view controller. I'm pausing there because it's a pretty powerful thing. You get a UI view controller. There's nothing that says VIPER. There's no interface. There's nothing that tells the rest of the app that this is a VIPER module. So you could take this out today and throwing a module into your application, and the rest of your code wouldn't notice that it comes from VIPER. So those are pretty much the benefits from adding the builder. You get that logic outside of the wireframe, and you can use this view controller anywhere in your code that you want. So before we wrap up, I also wanted to talk about how we can potentially incorporate SwiftUI and combine and whatever comes next into our code base. So in our template that we're seeing earlier, we could just modify using opaque types our view controller into some UI view controller. And then behind the hood, we could use a UI hosting controller, which is a SwiftUI class. It's essentially a UI view controller where the content is a view. Now, a view in SwiftUI is a protocol, so it does not extend UI view or anything that UI keep related, which is an interesting thing to distinct. And then for the navigation, you can use the links that come with SwiftUI and keep that shortcut that we used to have before, and just be able to connect, for example, when you tap on a cell row, or something like that, that you want to just path state through your presenter to a different view. Now, you notice we also had a lot of interfaces in different places. With this, if we incorporated combine as well, we could convert those into observables, or as Apple likes to call them, publishers, where you essentially are saying, okay, event-driven thing that happens through this property will be propagated to the subscriber, which is what you see there. And in that way, you avoid having all this many interfaces that you need to maintain. So this was pretty much our experience with it. I'll open for questions now. Yeah, all you.
Thank you very much, Juli.
Sure.
Anyone has a question? No one?
Don't be shy.
Okay, I think we don't.
Cool.
Yeah, here
All
I
right.
have one. No, wait a minute.
Yeah.
VIPER is an amazing architecture, and it's still difficult to me to adopt it because I always prefer BBM. Yeah, my question was how difficult will be the learning curve to use it with SwiftUI? You already showed something like with what is the goal in the near future. I'm just curious about how difficult will it be to use like another layer that will be like RX in this case. I mean reactive patterns that is combined in this case, right? How
Right.
difficult will it be to adopt it? And other thing is that modular object, right?
Yes.
Okay. Modular object looks great. I think you already solved the biggest problem, that is a lot of configuration in just one point, right?
Yep.
You can say that, yeah. If you want to adopt reactive patterns, how difficult will be it?
Sure, yeah. So in terms of the reactive part, the quickest thing is that you get rid of all the interfaces that come with VIPER and you subscribe to events instead. So you can completely remove them and have subscribers and propagate your events in that way, as opposed to having an interface. That was kind of the idea that I was trying to show with that. You don't necessarily have to use it everywhere if you don't want to, because it also increases the learning curve. But you can decide to use it on certain parts and not others. That's why the nice thing about keeping your interfaces originally, well, first that you can mock your objects as you're testing, and One other thing is that you can also do A/B testing pretty easily. So you can have your VIPER module, which would set maps to a particular screen in the app and provide a different implementation to it. Say you wanted to redesign your app or a particular screen, and then you can pretty easily just like use any feature flagging technology and just switch implementations in the same ways that you would mock your objects for testing. So the RX part of it is essentially a different way of doing that. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? We have time for one more. Well, I think we don't.
I'll ask one for myself. So most times I get asked, would you use this for a weekend project or some small project? And the answer is no. This is obviously something that you would do for a very large team and something that you want to scale and last for a long time. I don't do VIPER on the weekends, so yeah. Oh.